Good evening. It's evening for me. Anyway, the lecture tonight is on business ethics again, so I call it Business Ethics 2 because we didn't finish with the chapter last night. And we're probably not going to finish it with it tonight. Tonight, though, we're going to talk about theories. We got into theories a little bit, but we didn't cover them very thoroughly, so I thought we needed to do a little more on that. So anyway, I'll start off talking about, as we did before, developmental theories, character and reputation, and I'm thinking there in terms of religious codes. However, religious codes are more than just simply developmental. They're actually very judgmental. In other words, under the religious code, you're either a saint or a sinner, right? You know, you're either obeying the commandment or you're not. So we have commandments. These are absolutes, and they're uncompromising that way. And, not too many people, I think, actually follow a religious tenet. Although I know people who claim they do. I think a lot of times I've noticed that people do not follow their religions in exactly every detail. So for instance, in the Christian Bible it says, "Judge not lest you be judged." Almost all Christians, however, sit on juries, and they do judge people all the time, not only on juries but in their private lives. It's one thing to have a principle, it's another thing to follow it. Anyway, developmental theories, characters, and reputation, I've got this as a category. And under it I have religious codes and virtue ethics. Now I could put other things in there. And you have to remember, however, virtue ethics includes also some stoical ethics. Also, the Christian ethics are oftentimes very much influenced by that virtue ethics. So virtue ethics, assigning traits of character. Okay, so basically it assigns traits of character rather than making a judgment about people. It does, however, describe people in terms of characteristics. So people are not simply treated simply as a saint or a sinner. You were either obeying the law or you weren't obeying the law of Moses. And you were either a saint or a sinner then. With virtue ethics, you might be seen as courageous but foolish, or you might be seen as wise but cowardly, or some combination of things. So persons are evaluated in a much more complex way, and not necessarily condemned as not worthwhile. And people can be judged for different things. You might want to have a person who is a general who's courageous, and he might be, nonetheless, he may not have good temperance. That is, he may be drinking a lot, as Grant did. Or you might have some really great musician who's otherwise rather foolish with his money, like say Michael Jackson was. He was very foolish with his money, but he was a great musician, and so he had the virtue of being able to entertain people quite well. So it tends to be therefore more mutable, more changeable. You can learn or train to be better. So, with virtue ethics, I think the emphasis on is making people better by having them learn and having them train. And it's not just one thing, it's learning and doing that you have to do under virtue ethics. I think virtue ethics is largely misunderstood and underestimated. And there's a reason why it lasted so long, from 400 BC up until the Enlightenment. It was the ethic. And it had various forms. Like I said, there were Stoics and other kinds of forms of virtue ethics. But in the Enlightenment, we got into where we got the Enlightenment ethics of duty ethics, and utilitarian ethics became very dominant ethics. And other ethics followed. Existentialism and all kinds of other ethics followed. Relativistic theories and subjectivism. All kinds of theories followed, but we're not going to deal with all of those. We're just going to talk about the few. We'll talk a little about religious codes, we'll talk about virtue ethics, we'll talk about duty ethics, we'll talk about utilitarian ethics. We will talk about them. Okay, so the next group of ethics I'm going to talk about is formalistic ethics. This would include duty ethics. It's basically a formula, isn't it? Basically, it sets down rules. But you know, people who believe in duty ethics believe, I mean, originally certainly people believe that they would know right from wrong, and that they tend to believe in universal truths, that what's right is right in all times and all places, and so it's not very mutable. It has some absolutes. Probably one of the more mutable theories would probably be Kant's. However, he had some things that he was insisting upon. For example, lying is always wrong according to Kant. That is, the rationality of man makes him responsible, that you are responsible for everything. So these duty ethics, they set out sometimes very clear rules, just as religious ethics oftentimes do, and therefore religious ethics could be thought, the Ten Commandments could be thought of as a duty kind of ethic, but you know, it's a kind of more of extreme, whereas Kant's one is based upon people reasoning. However, there are certain things that he will not allow you to rationalize about, lying being the one that sticks out. Anyway, so utilitarian ethics, out of all our, you know, basically the utilitarian concept requires us to think about things in terms of our experience. We could choose the best practice, you know. It posits the ideal that we'll be able to choose the best thing, that we'll be able to predict the likely outcome, or that we will be able to predict that certain rules would lead to the right outcomes. That's rule utilitarianism. So rule utilitarianism actually has rules. Other utilitarians are just simply trying to decide what the outcomes is. So usually when we taught it at this level, at a very simple level, it's about the outcomes. And the question, however, is, once you realize that we're not always that good at knowing what the outcomes are, things are going to be, we can't predict what's going to happen. How many people were able to predict the coronavirus was going to crash the economy? Even people who maybe thought that there would be a coronavirus pandemic didn't necessarily get to the point where they realized that it would actually cause economic dislocations. However, people who study pandemics, the experts, did know that, and they were largely ignored, unfortunately. And say utilitarian ethics. So out of our experience, we choose the best practice, and you know, so we're trying to get the best. And if we're lucky, we do. Okay, lying destroys trust, which is why you don't lie. You know, so you're taking your daughter to have her dentist, and you know he's going to work on her teeth, and he's going to maybe be drilling a filling or something, and she wants to know whether it's going to hurt. Do you tell her, yes, it's going to hurt, and then you know what's going to happen? She's going to be clenching her mouth and refusing to open her mouth, and there's going to be a lot more pain associated with it because the doctors are going to have to pry her mouth open and keep it open somehow. And you know, to tell her the truth and risk the outcome where she makes it worse for herself, or do you actually lie to her so that she'll be cooperative with the dentist? However, I think the answer would probably be that you tell her the truth in a certain way. That is, you tell her that there may be some pain, but that she can make it better for herself if she cooperates with the dentist and keeps her mouth open and allows him to do it without struggling, that she only makes it worse if she fights it. And so I think young children can understand that concept if you let them know it. They're not that stupid. Okay. Anyway, so that's utilitarian ethics. You're choosing for the better. And so there's a big contrast between duty ethics, which tend to be very much kind of a fixed position, and the more flexible utilitarian ethics. And also the virtue ethics is much more flexible, certainly, than, say, the religious ethics. However, religious codes and virtue ethics are both kind of teleological in that you're looking at down the road what's going to happen, maybe. So let's move on. Religious codes and divine law. basically the advantages of a religious code is that the divine origin makes them infallible and fixable. So people who believe in them have the comfort of believing strongly in them, that they know this, what's right and wrong, and they're not hesitant. They're very confident when they're saying that. And so if you were in a group, let's say you were in a city which was dominated by very religious people who had this kind of a code and believed in that code, there maybe will be electing a leader, a mayor, all the people who represented them may be actually more inclined to show that inflexibility. Certain things are just wrong, and and they're not willing to compromise on it in order to make things better or to make exceptions for extraordinary cases. They're not able to do it because they don't have that flexibility. So the divine origin makes them infallible and fixed. They see that as an advantage. They know what the right thing is, and they can do the right thing, and it's very simple for them. The followers know what to expect both of themselves and of others, so they know what they're supposed to do, and they know what they can expect others to do, and what they can complain about if others don't behave as they should. It basically, a third advantage is it provides answer and it provides structure. So it's a highly structured kind of setting. You have that's all ahead of time. You know what the answers are going to be. So the disadvantages: not adaptable to changed circumstances, place, or time. So you get into this kind of like fixed situation, and if you have an extraordinary situation that arises, it's you might find that you have a conflict with what you've always believed, and how to behave becomes a problem because you believe that you have to behave a certain way, and so that's a disadvantage. Secondly, the discipline may be harsh and uncompromising. That is, if you were governed by, like I say, a religious oligarchy, they might adopt very harsh things. Like, so for instance, we talk about the fact that in Muslim countries, up until maybe very recently, and maybe even now for all I know in certain countries, they've chopped people's head off for infidelity, for cheating. They've cut people's hands off for stealing, and these were seen as totally necessary. And in fact, those kinds of harsh penalties will result in maybe a lot more compliance than easier penalties might adopt. So also the third disadvantage is it tends to close discussion on issues already determined by divine law. So there's no discussing it. It's already been determined. It says right here in the book, number 5. that's what you got to follow. So virtue ethics. Virtue ethics emphasizes character as a defining moral quality. So it focuses on people's character, and like I said, it's a more complicated view than just simply deciding that they're a saint or they're a sinner. It's not like, well, they're either going to hell or they're going to heaven. It's more like, well, this person we can tolerate and live with. So I can understand why Thomas Aquinas wrote the virtue ethics for Christians, and why he remains the philosopher of the Catholic Church, because he thereby introduced what was otherwise a very rigid system, a little more flexibility than you would otherwise have. Now, virtue ethics can be actually rigid, depending upon how you interpret it. I mean, if you want to interpret it that way, you can do that. And the other advantage, one of the things that advantage of the virtue ethics is the Romans further developed the Greeks' conception of virtue. So for all those years, from 400 BC until the middle of the maybe the 14th, actually the 18th, 17th century, the 18th century, the 1700s, until the Enlightenment, for all that 2,100 years, you had this development. You had many minds talking about what virtue ethics is. So if you want to look at how virtue ethics solved a problem like rage or anger, what were the answers? You might want to look at Seneca, who was a Roman, who basically was following the Roman version of virtue ethics, which was Stoicism. And there was not only Seneca, but there were Cicero and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who wrote very sincerely and authentically about problems they faced and how they resolved them. And some of it is very good. So Seneca said, has this famous story where he talks about, do not get deterred, do not allow anger to throw you off course. It's a distraction. That anger is a kind of madness and causes people to do very silly things and is usually not any useful. He says, you get angry because somebody insults you. Consider this. Somebody insults a rock. What happens? Nothing. So when somebody insults you, then it's best to treat it like you're a rock and just ignore it. And nothing's going to happen. The person who insults you is going to be very frustrated. He's not really getting the response he wanted. And so you're better off treating it that way. You can also sometimes treat it with humor and just kind of play around with the guy. If you have the mind to do that. But you got to be very careful because things can be very misconstrued. And so if you're not very clever, you might want to stay away from doing that. Maybe it's best for a lot of people just to ignore it, not to get in some sort of prolonged discussion that may be counterproductive. So anyway, virtue ethics dominated Western moral philosophy, like I said, from Aristotle up until the Enlightenment. That's from 400 BC till 1700. So the Romans further developed it in Greeks, and they emphasized work and patient suffering in service to your community and fellow citizens. So the Romans' focus was upon the community. It was upon being a good citizen, if you read many of these things, and doing that which you need to do to play your part in the community. And all the Roman stories seem to be focusing on that and focusing on your reaction and causing people to actually react in a better way. Mindset. To be virtuous is to have a particular mindset. Honesty is no virtue if done with evil intent or to harm others. This mindset is formed by practicing honesty even when it is difficult to be honest. Each virtue is a reflection on the character or habitual thought of a typical actor. So mindset is sort of your habitual thought. How do you usually handle situations? How do you react? How do you think about situations? Do you get depressed? I mean, with virtue, practicing virtue, you ought to be able to overcome. You have to learn how to overcome your depression and maybe look for what is good and that's happening. At the same time, you're going through a rough time, perhaps, but maybe there's still some good things in your life and appreciating those more. Yeah, okay. Aristotle's summary. There were three concepts that Aristotle talked about. The first is excellence of being. You can think of it, when I hear that, I think about the Marines. Be all that you can be. And the Marines basically have a training program. So they take in young men and they say, we're going to make you better. We're going to make a man out of you. And they proceed to train him, and they put him through some difficult times. And one of the first things they teach him is that he is part of a team. So a lot of what their exercise is to teach them the importance of that community that he is in, which is the Marines at that time. And he is a part of a team. And he's there to support his fellow Marines, and they're there for him. And so he acquires something that is valuable for human beings, has always been valuable for human beings, the ability to work together and to be devoted for a common cause, for the good of all and everyone. So all for one and one for all, right? And so that's that. So excellence of being. The second thing he focused on was practical wisdom. Basically the ideal is that with each virtue there is usually a middle point. So, there is courage, but then on either side of courage you would have maybe recklessness, where a person attacks when he shouldn't attack, which would be foolish. or is a person who won't attack with everybody else and is therefore a coward. So a person needs to, attack when the officer gives the signal, and either way, either side of that is going to be unacceptable and not courageous. So we want people to be courageous. So if you were in the Marines, you would be taught that your officer will give you the signal, or your sergeant give you the signal, or whoever's in command at that time will give you the signal, and then you need to obey. And the third thing he emphasized was what you might consider the goal of all this, which was sometimes the word was eudaimonia, but it's translated as true happiness or true success, not a materialistic success, oftentimes understood as being the accomplishment of some goal that's important to you, something that you really want to think is worthwhile accomplishing. Might be the true success that you're after. So it might not be becoming fabulously wealthy, or or getting a lot of adulation for people. Some other way of finding it. That's the kind of thing that you want. You want to be able to find your true success, what it is that would make you feel that you would really accomplish something. Something that's very personal to you would be your true success. And that's what he was talking about. Okay, Aristotle believed virtues were learned and acquired by practicing them. Even the good-natured need instruction, according to Aristotle. A person might be inclined to do good things. However, some may be inclined to do good by their nature. That may be what we would say their genes, maybe. Or they might be inclined to do good things because of the circumstances under which they grew up. They grew up in a good family, and were likely to do good things because they happen to be wealthy, so they're generous and they're willing to work for others, and they see the value of hard work, and that their father is a successful man. So by their circumstances, they become better that way. But they may be described as naturally virtuous then. However, if they fail to do good under that circumstance, out of ignorance for what is actually the good, or lack of a developed skill. In other words, they haven't been trained right. So a lot of successful men have raised children who are not very successful. Some of that may not be the children's fault, maybe the parents' fault, in that sometimes they were overly demanding and inflexible in the demands on their children, or there are other factors where they created a lot of anxiety, or some other way. So a lot of this might come down sometimes to luck, but people need to learn what is the good, what is that true happiness. They need to find that, and they need to understand how to achieve these things and how to achieve them in an honorable way. To be virtuous requires both instruction and practice. So you're not necessarily virtue unless you practice it. So the Romans and the Greeks, they had their great success, I think, in the world because they did practice those virtues that they felt were necessary for their success. Their soldiers were courageous, and they were required to be so by their training and by their practice. And generally, they had at times very wise rulers. Sometimes they had very foolish rulers. I suppose sometimes people say that sometimes great success is precedes the fall. So pride precedes the fall. To be virtuous requires both instruction and practice. These provide the capacity. By what I mean by that, I mean in some cases a moral sensitivity, so you understand what's really necessary. Sometimes a perception of what's good, a perception of what's going on, to understand what's truly happening and not be misled by your desires. So a lot of people will believe what they want to believe. Things that make them look good or make them feel good is what they tend to want to believe, and they do believe those things sometimes. So you find people who very foolishly, psychologically fall into the trap of believing false things because it suits them, and not because they are willing to face what the truth is actually. Imagination, sometimes you have to be able to imagine what it's like in somebody else's shoes. to know how to interact with people. And emotional intelligence is a very important part of that. And so this all comes about by training. Experience, and whatever it is that you're needing to do, you need to gain the experience. Whatever it is that's key to your successful life, you need to gain the experience, and therefore you need to put yourself in situations where you'll be able to acquire that. And judgment. Oh, these are all what are required to act beneficially. Okay, so he saw virtue as a continuum. I think I kind of hinted at that before. Aristotle believed virtuous acts were acts performed at the mean of a continuum between the two virtues. So I mentioned the fact that courage. On the one side you have cowardliness, where the guy doesn't get up and attack. On the other side you have recklessness, when he gets up when he shouldn't and attacks and gets killed. And neither one of them are the kind of courage that we want. Then there's honesty. You have dishonesty, a person who's lying, cheating. And then you have people who have a lack of tact, that will unnecessarily tell somebody something that's true with the only purpose of hurting that person, or the only effect, the only outcome is that person gets hurt. And that's, it's recognized that that is not honesty. A virtue ethicist would say, well, that's not being honest, that's being tactless. And another one I use as an example, compassionate. On one side you would have indifference, where you don't care. I'm not my brother's keeper. On the other side you would have hateful. Well, he deserved that. He deserved that. He did this. He must have deserved that, because God wouldn't have let that happen to him unless, he had done something wrong. So that's kind of a hateful statement to make. You don't know the circumstances, and who are you to say how God works? Anyway, engaged. You can be complacent, or you can be arrogant. Complacent, you just kind of let things go along as they are. Engaged, you're watching what's going on and you're participating in what's going on. You're a good citizen. You're thinking about what's happening, and you're willing to speak up when you don't agree, and you're willing to listen to others at the same time. Being arrogant is wanting to take control when it's really not appropriate for you to do so. So there's a certain way that you rise to a position of honor and prestige, and you've got to follow the accepted, legitimate means of acquiring power, and not act arrogantly. So I think there was a general, one time when the president was, I think it was Reagan, he was indisposed, and this general was at this conference, and he made it clear that he was in charge now. And actually, there was a vice president, so it was kind of a bizarre thing for him to say. That sounds almost arrogant. A lot of people think arrogant is just being pride, and some extent it is being pride, but it's actually taking onto yourself authority and powers that you don't have. I had an aunt. We went to the airport to get some people who had visited us from Scotland and get them on the plane so they would make it on the right plane. Me and my little sister, I was 18, she was 12 maybe, 13. Knew the airport well. We'd been there many times, but my aunt, who was from another town entirely, 100 miles away, had been there a few times. When we got to the airport, me and my sister said, this is the way to go. My aunt overruled us and said, no, they don't know what they're doing, they're just children. And she insisted, and we walked into the wrong way. And then when we got to where she got us to a ticket counter, we found out that she didn't know, everybody knew that she didn't know what she was talking about. And then they started following us. So it was arrogant for her to take over. It was not arrogant for us to try to take over, because we knew she was wrong. So it's not a matter of whether or not you've been appointed with the authority, or that even. Matter of degree. Virtue can also be expressed as a matter of degree. Virtuous but conflicted. The actor does good only by an act of willpower. I use the example sometimes. There is a diamond necklace that's outside of a shop, a jewelry shop. It's laying on the sidewalk, and maybe somebody who came out of the sidewalk, out of that jewelry store, maybe lost it. And so there's two things you can do. You can pick it up, maybe keep it or sell it, or you could take it into the shop and have it and turn it in for the jeweler and ask him to try to find who it is that owns it. You could also hold it and advertise in the newspaper for somebody who would maybe have lost this. What should you do? The virtuous thing is not to keep it yourself, obviously, and to try to find out who lost it. It may have sentimental value to that person, and therefore it's a very nice thing for you to do. And actually, you should try to do that. Now, you know, what people do though is different. So, if Mother Teresa, the famous saint from India who took care of all those poor people, were walking along and she saw that necklace, I think that she probably would have gone inside and said, "Do you know who owns this jewelry?" and tried to find the owner and get the jewels returned to the owner. I don't know whether she would have advertised it or whether she would have left it with the jeweler. I don't know. Would she have taken the jewels and sold them for the poor? I don't think she would do that, okay? Now, if we take a different person of a different character, Captain Jack Sparrow, the pirate, he's likely to actually take the jewels and keep it because that's what he does, right? So, but if he did say, well, this is wrong, somebody might really value this and I should try to find who it is, and he did make the attempt and took it into the jeweler and tried to find the owner, he would be acting probably conflicted. He would probably want to keep it. So we would perceive him as a person who in the past has taken people's jewels off of them, and therefore we would suspect that he would probably be conflicted in that situation. He might do the right thing, but it would be hard for him to do it. Does that make him more virtuous? I think not. I think the more virtuous person, the truly virtuous person, is the actor who does good without struggling with the evil desire. Mother Teresa, who's taken a vow of poverty, doesn't have the evil desire to keep the goods and is happy to do good despite her own inclinations or interests. And so that's conflicted. So there's some people who may do things, but sometimes they may have other reasons, or they may be acting out of character. And if they continue to act out of character, we would say they have acquired a virtue. Virtue ethic is descriptive. There is mounting evidence, scientific evidence, supporting Aristotle's ethical belief in the sociability of man. Aristotle thought men were sociable. The Greeks were famous for their phalanx. In the phalanx, each Greek stood shoulder to shoulder with another Greek, and they lined up all together, and they had their spears pointing outward, and they would just mow down the enemy in front of them because they just kept that unity. Apparently, the people that they didn't fight didn't really understand that principle of keeping a unified force. I know, of course, that strategy was eventually imitated by everybody, but so nothing lasts forever. So I mean, they had great success in their working as a team, and and so to this day we realize now to this day that the way you want to do these things is to act as a team. The way we're going to beat the coronavirus is by everybody working together and to do as the experts tell us, and not as some know-it-all arrogant people who just simply, without any qualification whatsoever, decide that they know better than everybody else. Okay. Anyway, compassion is both evidence that this the universality of such virtues as honesty, courage, compassion, these kinds of things, the fact that we hold these as virtue is evidence of our sociability and the value of certain characteristic to any society. He derived his ethical system and his virtues from observation of the natural needs of the civilized Greek world. Reciprocity. Another thing that comes in more recently now, we realize that a special quality of man is his natural instinct to behave reciprocally. If we were actually, I mean, there was obviously a lot of times when we would fight, but there was also throughout the world oftentimes a lot of trading. And I believe that prosperity came about with nations that were willing to trade that were willing to work with others to get things that they could not easily acquire or couldn't make themselves, and were willing to trade. This reciprocity is a special thing. The reciprocity is the basis for the great cooperative effort, which is civilization. So we live in a cooperative society. Somebody else kills the animals and harvests the crops that I eat, and other people will make the clothes, and all I do is my teaching. And so we each have a role to play, and we become better at it and better at it. And by working as a team, we actually wound up with more. And so this reciprocity, some people talk about a reciprocity gene, that we tend to be that way quite naturally. Communities that foster virtues such as trust, courage, and candor are likely to flourish. So basically, communities that develop in their citizens virtue can do much better than those that do not. Criticism. Virtues can conflict. To be honest about another's appearance might not be compassionate. Response. That this is only an apparent conflict. Under certain circumstances, being tactless is not being honest, while in other cases, being indifferent to another's need to know is not being compassionate. So you have this conflict. Perhaps you feel that your uncle who has to go in and teach in a class doesn't look good in a new wig that he bought that was cheap, and you think he needs to know that it doesn't look good. And at the same time, you don't want to make him feel bad about having made that decision. So you're somewhat in a dilemma. You have to use your practical wisdom to figure out what the best way is of telling him what you've got to tell him without hurting his feelings or allowing him to discover it for himself somehow. So you've got to be more clever, and we human beings can be very clever, and we can do these things. And so it's only an apparent problem. Okay. Virtues are culturally determined and relative over time and place. Okay, this is true. That, how I might define courage, how Aristotle might define courage, might be defined differently in different kinds of things. So courage in Japan might be the willingness during World War II to lay down one's life, not for the Japanese society, but for the emperor. That's what those people believed. So they have their own determination of what courage is. But nonetheless, we all have an ideal that courage is the willingness to actually risk, if not sacrifice, your life for some higher value or something of higher value. Japanese just simply believed that the emperor was the higher value. Not something that we would agree to, but we ought not to say that these men were reckless because they were following and sacrificing themselves. They were believing they were doing something for a good reason. Talk a little bit about Kant's duty ethics. The view that Kant had the view that ethics consist of obeying certain rational rules arising out of duties which are themselves universal moral maxims. So it's very important to him that these to be universal commands, universal rules, that they not change over time and place and circumstances. So lying was always wrong, no matter to whom you were lying, and there was no reason you could be lying. Why was lying wrong? Because Kant said that we need to interact with human beings, that we should respect all human beings. And therefore, if we believe that if we tell this person the truth, he will do the wrong thing, we're not showing respect for him. We're not giving him the chance to do the right thing. And that we ought not to do that. That's arrogant of us, as Kant would maybe see it. And on the other hand, obviously, lying is a very serious wrong in many cases. It can destroy the trust. And therefore you need to use your practical wisdom, as I said earlier, to find the right way of telling a person a message where there are conflicts, where there are conflicting virtues, conflicting values that have to be negotiated. And so you need to do that. But certainly you always need to be aware that if you're not telling this person the truth, that you're endangering the trust that that person has to you. So that's why you want to not tell your daughter that, no, there's not going to be any pain. She's going to know there's pain, and after that, she's going to not trust you as much. Your ideal was that it would be better because she would cooperate with the dentist, but she's only going to cooperate with the dentist until she realizes this is painful, and then she's going to be back to fighting it. So a better approach would be to persuade her that her best course would be to cooperate with the dentist and to lessen the pain that way, and give her confidence that she can do that. Wish I could always think of these things when these things arise. Anyway, so the rightness of the act is determined by whether it is required, permitted, or prohibited. And so in some sense, it's deontological. These rights are to some extent maybe absolute. For Kant, I think there's a lot more flexibility in Kant than there are in other duty systems, certainly a lot more than, say, in a religious system. He would allow for a lot of leeway. As we'll see, that his main categorical imperatives were devoted to the ideal of the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule, I believe, brings in a certain amount of flexibility to his system. Anyway, but it's a very logical, reasonable system, and therefore has oftentimes led people to believe that all they had to do was their duty, which I don't believe was what his intention was. That's called moral minimalism, that I just need to do what I'm told to be done by who's ever in authority over me. Is I don't think what he actually intended for people to do. I think he intended them to follow something that's similar to the Golden Rule. I'm not going to give you the categorical imperative just now. We'll get into it later. People are to be treated as ends, not as means to an end. So this also should bring into his system some flexibility. So, in fact, a person doing something might be good for the community, but if it's terrible, if it has terrible consequences for that individual, we need to think about what we can do to help that individual, and not merely think about what's good for our society. So, him doing his duty, if it's going to result in his death, like Japanese kamikaze pilots, it's kind of totally foreign to the Western way of thinking, even for a person who believes in duty ethics. Of course, the Japanese pilots saw it as their duty. Moral obligation doesn't change over time, place, or circumstances. That's the universality element of it. That the rule is the rule, and it's always the same for everybody in every place, and there are no exceptions to lying, at least. There's one rule that he absolutely was very clear on, that he made no exceptions for it. He wouldn't allow you to lie to save a slave that's being pursued by slave catchers. He wouldn't allow you to lie to protect your friend from a criminal who's going to kill him if he finds out where he's at and you know where he's at. Basically, Kant would give away the location of your jewels to a burglar rather than lie and say, I don't know where those jewels are. Okay, and he knows full well it's behind that picture is the safe. And he would give it away because he feels obligated to tell the truth, even to this burglar. So this is something that bothers me with Kant's thing. Other than that, a lot of what he says makes sense. I believe that lying is a very serious thing, and there are people who trust you. You should never, or you should very rarely, and you have to have a very good exception, and you can't be a self-serving one to lie, say, to your wife. Let's say you're a man who's cheated on his wife, and she's asking him about it. What should he do? Should he lie and maybe she'll get a divorce? And he says, well, gee, I don't want that divorce to happen. It's better if I lie to her. No. It's also, eventually when she finds out, she'll know she can't trust him. It's much better for him to honestly admit it and take whatever the consequences are of that. If she decides to divorce, it's her personal right. So Kant also believed in a person's autonomy, that people had a right to decide for themselves. If she wanted to stay married to a man who would cheat on her, that's her personal right. But if she wanted to leave that man then she ought to be able to rid herself of that concern, of that anxiety that would be associated with such an individual. And for him to say, oh, we're both going to lose so much, the children are going to be hurt by this, and use that as an excuse isn't right. Okay. The rightness of an act is determined by whether it is required, permitted, or prohibited, period. People are treated as ends, not means, so you have to treat your wife not as a means of keeping your family together, but as a person entitled to her own life and entitled to be free of whatever bothers her. Okay. And same goes for your husband. I sound very chauvinistic here, as if men were the only people who cheat. We know that's not true. And so moral obligation doesn't change over time, place, and circumstance. The duties are discoverable using our human minds and our internalized map of expectations of human beings. We all have that. We all are able to read, to some extent, another person's mind. We can oftentimes figure out what a person thinks of. Certain people are very clever at hiding what they're thinking, but a lot of times with many people we can read their minds. Some people are not trying to hide their minds at all, and it depends upon the character. But so we're all pretty good at doing that, and so we can make a judgment as to what the outcome would be. You could make a judgment as to what the outcome would be by telling your wife the truth. And then you need to still tell her the truth, but you need to tell it to her in a positive light, that you need to tell her that you are sorry for it and that it was a mistake and you do not intend to do it again. And if you've done it more than once, she may challenge that, but you've dealt with her in an honest way that respects her autonomy, her right to make her own decisions. So duties are discoverable with our rational minds. We can think about it, we know. If we think about it, we know what we can do. We know that if we lie this time, what's going to stop us from doing it the next time? We say we don't want to do it again, but we know we have this weakness, so we ought to acknowledge that and live up to it and try to make it better and work on our faults. And we're not going to work on them if we can hide them. Primacy of rules. All persons are rational and therefore able to know and live up to the rules, which do not change from person to person. Motive is important. An act isn't ethical unless it's done for the right reason. So if you're selling cars and you're telling people you're honest and you do some acts of honesty, but you're just doing them in order to get to sell cars, that's not really a virtue. That's a calculated thing, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But we can't be actually too enthusiastic about that. You're putting honest John on your autos, on your cards, may be actually very misleading. You actually will eventually lie, perhaps. It's just a matter of time and circumstance. Duties must be followed even where the result of doing so is disastrous. So I think I'll leave it here because I don't have much time left, and we'll pick up here with the next class session. And there are going to be, when I post this tomorrow on the website, I'll have 5 questions at the very end, and maybe more. So talk to you later.